So the idea of these Pew Talks are we just give them sort of little 15-minute snippets. And I thought it'd be good perhaps to do a story from the Old Testament. I suppose nowadays a lot of people perhaps come into Christianity cold. What I mean by that is they've got no experience whatsoever of Christianity before they get converted. In other words, you know, it's a complete mystery to them. It used to be, years and years ago, somebody sounding very old saying it, it used to be that Bible stories were well known because they were taught in schools, or people used to go to Sunday school and the like, but nowadays we don't really tend to get that. So what I thought I'd do is I'd pick on a really unusual story, right? I thought I'd pick on a story that might leave some people open-mouthed and saying, what? Does it really say that? And so I'm going to talk about the story of Balaam. And I'm only going to have really one point at the end of it to make, but along the way, let's just have a little look at the story of Balaam. So, what we have, how many people know the story if I say the story of Balaam? Okay, let's do it the other way around. How many people don't know the story? Okay, so a few people as well. That's fine. So the story of Balaam, the question is it a Shrek-like fairy tale or is it real? And the reason I say that, it's probably one of the most unusual stories in the Bible. And the story goes something like this. The children of Israel have come out of Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've crossed over, and now they're about to move into the Promised Land. But obviously there is opposition from some of the people who live in the adjacent countryside. And the king of Moab really doesn't want the Israelites returning to their home country. And so what he does, he goes and gets somebody to lay a curse on them. And there was a well-known prophet, not what we think of as a prophet, but a well-known prophet of the time called Balaam, who lived in the north of the country. And he promises to get Balaam down there, and he promises Balaam a whole pile of cash if he'll come down and lay a curse on the children of Israel. And so, when he starts doing his divination, his sort of fortune-telling, God actually breaks in and says, don't go. Don't lay a curse against Israel, because I'm going to bless them. Now, he's got a problem. And the problem is he's just been promised a boatload of cash. Right? So, on one side, he wants to go. On the other side, his own results of his own magic, whatever it was, have told him not to go. So what do you do when you get in a situation like that? Well, he goes back again and says, surely I can go, I want to go, and he tries to persuade God, if you like, to let him go. And God says, okay, go. But you only say what I tell you to say, and you can't curse Israel. Now, let's stop for a second and think about it. The only reason this guy going is for what? The only reason he's going is for money. The only reason he wants to try and change God's mind is because he is selfish and wants to get something out of it. Yeah? And he's determined. Now, the story gets really interesting. Because actually, what happens, he's riding his donkey. This really tells us, actually, it's a really ancient story. Because the people of the time didn't have horses. Donkeys were the beast. Kings used to, it's a silly image to get in your head, but kings used to ride into battle riding on donkeys. It isn't exactly sort of, you know, medieval jousting and Game of Thrones. It's, you know, people sitting with long legs on donkeys virtually touching the ground as they run at each other with swords waving. And yeah, Balaam is going down this path. And suddenly his donkey stops. So he starts kicking the donkey, and the donkey won't go. So he beats the donkey, he thrashes the donkey, he loses his temper, has a rage with the donkey, and the donkey won't move. Eventually he gets to the point where he's furious, and the donkey turns around and speaks to him and says, "Can't you see the angel in front of us?" And suddenly he sees the angel and realizes this angel has appeared, and this donkey stopped because he's seen the angel. Now, I find this an astonishing story, and most people will find this an astonishing story. Donkeys don't have vocal cords. They don't speak. You might have noticed, if you've been to a petting zoo, they don't say, "Oi, give us some sugar." They're not equipped to speak, and yet that's what the story says. And so he eventually goes to Moab, and he gives a prophecy, but every prophecy he gives actually comes out as positive for the Israelites and doom for the other nations. And King Balak isn't particularly pleased because he's paid good money to get this guy here, and he's not really delivering. Hey-ho. But Balaam gets the last laugh in a sense, because he really wants his money. And so what he does at the very end, and it's not recorded in the Old Testament, but in Revelation, in the New Testament, adds this detail that really wasn't there before. And it says, "You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, so they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality." So if we just jump back, basically what he did was he told the Moabite king to lure the Israelites into breaking their own law. And he did it through this advice. And it says this: "While Israel was staying in Sittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to sacrifice to their gods. The people ate their sacrificial meal and bowed down before the gods. So Israelite yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them." So basically what happened was he ended up sort of having to deliver the prophecies that God insisted on, but at the same time got his money's worth by finding a way to undermine the children of Israel. So there's a story. I told you it was a strange story, didn't I? You know, if you come to this fresh, you're probably going to go again, "What? Really? Donkeys? Talking?" It's sort of really quite strange. And everybody used to turn around and say this is a classic story of why the Bible can't possibly be true, because it clearly is silly. That's what people used to say. However, these fragments were found in 1963, I believe it was, might be 62. And these fragments revealed this plaster, and it's now in a major museum in Jordan. And it basically says this is warnings from the book of Balaam, the son of Beor. He was a seer of the gods. And it dates back to the exact time that the Bible talks about it. I've got to tell you, this was such a shock to historians. An absolute shock that this character mentioned in the Bible actually was a real character. And in fact, the place where he lived still has lots of traditions about him. And so it became quite interesting, really, because it talks about the book of Balaam. And it's clear that he left his own account, if you like, of his life. And so here's a simple question. Who wrote the book of Numbers? Fingers on buzzers. Sorry? Moses. Yeah, absolutely. Here's another question. Who told Moses the story of what happened? Well, I guess, yes. There's only a couple of possible answers. Either the angel or God, if you like, or Balaam himself. Or maybe Balaam wrote down that story in his own writing to tell people just what had happened. Just a thought. However, just as we finish, my wife hasn't signaled yet to say that I'm running out of time. There could be a shock of a lifetime here. I could finish early, and this has never been known. What I do want to draw a serious point from is this, and this really is a very, very important point. Balaam becomes a picture of a man who wants God's permission to break God's law. Do you get that? The Bible tells us that all of the Old Testament is there to give us examples that we can learn from. But it's interesting that there's something in our makeup as people whereby we think God's word is wonderful until. It's an interesting word, until it isn't convenient for us. And the major mistake that people make is quite simply they think like this: I know God has said this, but I'm an exception because my circumstances are different. I think there's probably been many people, sadly, many godly people, sometimes ministers, who've ended up caught in a cycle of thought that goes something like this: I've fallen in love. My wife doesn't understand me. My marriage is cold, and I'm not speaking about us. Disclaimers in there straight away. My marriage is cold. There's no love left, but I've now fallen in love. And what goes through their mind is this: I know it's not right, but in this case, has to be right. Because it feels so right. I'm almost ready to burst into song. What's that song? How can something be so bad, feel so good? Do you know what I mean? Friends, I've got to say that Christians are suckers for exactly this. And it goes back to the beginning, way back. If you remember, even in Eden, Satan says to Eve, surely God didn't say. You know, the guy at work that turns around and says, but I will lose my house and my family. My children might get taken into care. I'll be thrown on the scrap heap for the rest of my life. Surely it's going to be okay for me just to take this money. I'll put it back afterwards. I believe very much that we should never pray for permission to break God's word. It leads to a hard heart. It leads to a dangerous hardness of hearts. And the Bible tells us that God is grieved by the hardness of hearts. And it leads definitely to spiritual decline. I don't know why I've bought this particular story with this particular message. But maybe somebody here or somebody watching finds himself in a tough spot. Let me just say, God's called us to be honorable. It's a dangerous thing having to preach it, because now, of course, I'll find myself in some situation where I'll feel exactly the same. Friends, we cannot break God's word. We cannot pray for permission to break God's word. We cannot pretend it's not important. And we do it at our peril. May God bless you.